The most critical dimension of leadership is clarity about the values for which you stand, and a clear-minded program about how you translate those values into a program of policy action which makes a material and not just an emotional change in the world.
I'd first like to welcome you and thank you for generously giving your time to participate in the 2021 Dirrum Festival. It is an honour to have you with us today in your capacity as twice former Prime Minister, President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and former member of the Radford community. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We recognise that this and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Hannah and I'm in Year 12.
My name is Astrid and I'm in Year 8.
Good morning, Mr. Rod. I'm Dry and I'm currently in Year 11. Let's get straight into it. Given the theme for this year's festival is Stepping Stones for a Better Tomorrow, what do you believe is the biggest issue for Australia to solve to ensure the future prosperity of our nation?
There's always a challenge in public political life to make absolute and finite choices between, quote, the most important challenge, unquote. For me, the three big ones are navigating this country's economic future, given the enormous disruptions occurring across the global economy through the artificial intelligence revolution, or what some describe as the fourth industrial revolution. And my desire as a former Prime Minister not to see Australia left behind, and more importantly, for your generation to have the best and most diverse set of interesting jobs possible for the future. The second for me is climate. And these are of co-equal status in my mind. And on the climate question, it is to ensure that Australia becomes once again a global leader on climate change action, not a laggard. And the reason for that is not rhetorical or political. The reason is that Australian leadership globally on climate matters. I've seen that in the past with what we have done before. I've seen it, for example, in relation to the work that we did in the Copenhagen summit on climate change in 2009. And we should do that again. And the reason for needing to do that again is that we are already the driest continent on Earth. So being leaders rather than laggards on climate change action, both domestically and globally. And the third big one is navigating our future in the region and the world, given the enormous complexity of the challenge represented by the rise of China. And so for me, they're the three big ones. They are of co-equal significance. So I'm sorry to give you a complex answer to a straightforward question, Jo.
Thank you. You began your first speech in Parliament by saying that our most critical responsibility in this Parliament is how power is used, whether it is used for the benefit of the few or the many. What do you believe are the fundamentals of strong leadership, and what was your proudest achievement that demanded the most of you as a leader?
I think in terms of leadership, wherever you are, in the school community at Radford, in the territory government of the ACT, or in national leadership, the most critical dimension of leadership is clarity about the values for which you stand, and a clear-minded program about how you translate those values into a program of policy action which makes a material and not just an emotional change in the world. And so it is both values and plan, if you like. In terms of my own period leading the country, again, I'm not much into binary choices. Was it this or was it that? But the two or three which obviously stick closely in my mind was one, the national apology to Indigenous Australians, simply because I think it was about 200 years overdue. And then secondly, it had a material change in the way in which, frankly, race relations and Indigenous reconciliation has been transacted since. There's a reason for that. It's because through the apology and the way in which it was framed and phrased, that despite the fact that the Liberal and National Party came kicking and screaming to the table, they nonetheless still had to put their hand up in support of the resolution of the Parliament, which was the apology statement. And so that has prevented subsequent large-scale breakouts of official racism in the country. And for example, the fact that in you and your greeting today could proudly refer to the Indigenous owners of the land on which we meet, in your case, the Ngunnawal people, and is because 10 years ago that was not done at all. 10 years ago, welcomes to country, that is acknowledging the Indigenous owners of itself, was unusual. It was not normal. And so the way in which we affect, as it were, the culture and protocol of the way in which we handle ourselves is important. Two other quick things I'd touch on. One, in the economy. In the midst of the global financial crisis, we avoided a recession, and at the same time, we were able to invest radically in important infrastructure across the country using our stimulus strategy. For example, we built new libraries or new multi-purpose facilities in every primary school in Australia. So that's not a bad thing. But to keep people in work was even more important. I think the third thing was, internationally, I was able to secure Australia's membership of the G20 at summit level, which for the first time placed Australia at the top economic table of the world. So, and that took a lot of effort in terms of private diplomacy. So those three, I think, are big ones. By the way, stopping Japanese whaling in the South Pacific, the Southern Ocean, and thereby leaving our whale population unmolested, I thought was not a bad one on the way through when I took Japan to the International Court of Justice, and we won.
Well, all those achievements were extremely influential and something to be very proud of. On to the next question. How do you believe current and future Australian governments should respond to China's growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, what I've long called for is a level of balance in the way in which we deal with China's rise. The truth is, China is not what they call status quo power. That is, it is a changing power. It wants to change the boundaries in the South China Sea in relation to Taiwan, in relation to the East China Sea, in relation to the Sino-Indian border. And beyond that, China wishes to expand its own sphere of influence. Now, we may say that that is what great powers normally do in history. But in the 21st century, we are the beneficiary of rules which were devised in the 20th century after the end of the Second World War through the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter outlined an entire fabric of international law and international institutions to arbitrate disputes between states. And so therefore, in navigating China's rise, we need to work with all countries, including China, to ensure that China remains within the rules and norms of the international rules-based system, which has been painstakingly developed over the last 3/4 of a century. Because if those rules go out the back door, then we're left with the law of the jungle. It's not to say that the Americans in the past have always adhered to the rule. They haven't. I can point to a big example when they invaded Iraq back in 2003, something which I, among others, led the opposition to through the Australian Labor Party and the Parliament at the time. But we need to have a rules-based system. Final point is, in dealing with China, I've always said that Australia itself should have 5 simple principles. 1, be clear with the Chinese that we come from a tradition which respects universal human rights. China doesn't. Second, we are an ally of the United States and have been that way for the last 3/4 of a century, and that's not likely to change either. Thirdly, however, we do wish to prosecute a full-blooded economic relationship with China and trade and investment in other economic ties. Fourthly, we want to work with China globally on challenges like climate change and global economic governance. and pandemics, which is what we should be doing today. And finally, the final principle for Australia is if you're going to have a major disagreement with China, then given the relative size of the two countries, it's far better Australia does so in company with others rather than it simply does so unilaterally by itself. So there are 4 or 5 principles I think may be relevant for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Rod. Last year, you started a petition that called for a royal commission into the concentration of media ownership in Australia, attracting over 500,000 signatures. What are the most pressing consequences of Australia's concentrated media ownership, and how may we best overcome such a threat?
Well, the Murdoch media in Australia owns 70% of Australia's in total print readership. By the way, I've just been for a run. That's why I'm sweating. That's not because of the intensity of the question. So you could conclude that as well. I think with 70% of the print readership in this country controlled by one man, that's unhealthy in any democracy because there's insufficient diversity of news reporting and opinion. There's a second problem as well. Many folks in your generation will say, I've never read a newspaper in my life. Okay, that is, go into the shop and buy one because you consume all your product online. That's fine. That's basically the same as me. But guess what? A lot of the online news content is generated by News Corporation as well. And that's News Corporation online is a very big presence. There's a third reason as well. And that is that Murdoch also controls a television network called Sky TV, which now, as of yesterday, actually broadcast free-to-air right across regional Australia. And on top of that, not just has its own broadcast footprint, but rebroadcast through YouTube. And now Murdoch has the biggest single YouTube channel in Australia for a news and current affairs outfit, much bigger than the ABC, by the way. So therefore, it's not just what happens in print, that is those pieces of paper you see in dwindling numbers at the newsagent when you walk in of a morning, or that you may have seen your parents reading or your grandparents still reading. It's because it actually bleeds through to the rest of the media platform. And right across all the social media platforms. So I don't think the concentration of that amount of power in a single person's hands, given that free access to news and information is the lifeblood of any democracy long-term, is healthy for the democracy. Secondly, that's why I took up the petition. And as you know, we got the largest number of signatures to an online petition in the history of the Australian Parliament. And that was only done in 28 days. So people are angry about it. There's more than 500,000 signatures collected very quickly. Thirdly, what I believe needs to be done, and the point of the submission is call on the Australian Parliament to establish a royal commission, which is a full judicial inquiry into A, the abuse of media monopoly powers now in Australia, and B, to recommend alternative legislative models for better media diversity of ownership in the future, across all platforms, not just traditional print, but also television and radio, and of course, the social media platforms as well. That, I think, is the best way forward, and that's why I put forward the proposal I have.
Fantastic, thank you. There's been a lot of publicity in the media lately around the rate of the vaccination program in Australia, and we'd also like to acknowledge the efforts of millions of people who are currently in lockdown, including those in southeast Queensland. What do you believe Australia needs to do to achieve the 70% and 80% vaccination targets set by the National Cabinet last week?
I'll try not to be too political in my response to this, but it will be along these lines. The Prime Minister should do his job. And the Prime Minister's job is pretty basic here. To order enough vaccines which work for all Australians to be vaccinated early. And that's what they dropped the ball on last year. I think you know the detail of what happened through the misguided negotiations between the government and one of the major global pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, And basically, we put too many eggs in one basket with one category of vaccine, which is called AstraZeneca. Under-ordered Pfizer, failed to place an effective early order for the alternative big players like what's called J&J, Johnson & Johnson, or Moderna, what's called the mRNA genre or category of vaccines. So they failed to make enough orders early, diverse enough orders early. So in order to plug the gap, as I've repeatedly said to the Prime Minister, get onto the telephone to speak to the heads of all the pharmaceutical companies to bring forward the orders as quickly as possible. And there's a second reason for doing that as well. Once you've been vaccinated twice, for example, with Pfizer, increasingly the epidemiological evidence is that after a given period of time, your antibodies start to decline again and you need a further Pfizer booster. So therefore, it is not just getting to the initial vaccination rate of not 70%, but looking carefully at the statement by the Prime Minister the other day and looking at some of the scientific data on this, closer to 80% of the whole population in order to be effective. It's making provision in the forward ordering as well for the replenishment of those vaccines with further booster shots. And guess what? My experience of politics is that if you're a political leader, there's an invention. I know it's old-fashioned, but it's called a telephone, and you get onto it and you talk to people. You've got a checkbook handy. It's called the Commonwealth of Australia checkbook. You can write fairly significant checks to order these vaccines. Final point is, you may or may not remember because, let me see, Hannah, how old are you? 17?
17, yes.
Yeah. So back in 2009, so that's 12 years ago, you would have been 5, right? There was an outbreak in the world of what's called swine flu, H1N19. And at the time, I was Prime Minister, and we had to make provision for a whole series of antiviral treatments as well as vaccines. Now, we massively overordered for these things, spent hundreds of millions of dollars doing it, and stockpiled antiviral treatments. I think from memory, they were called Relenza and Tamiflu. And then there was the actual vaccine itself. As it turned out, the virus disappeared largely of its own accord globally. And we didn't have to call upon this stockpile that we'd accumulated. Guess what? I make no apology for having accumulated the stockpile, because I never wanted to be in a position that we were caught unprepared if it began to cut a swathe through Australia. Still, even with swine flu, we lost about 200 Australians to swine flu, and there were quite a large number of infections, and it killed 500,000 people around the world. And so these things are not to be trifled with. But in the full scope of political life, what happened was the then Liberal Party and National Party, led by Peter Dutton, actually attacked us for being wasteful by spending so much money in pre-ordering all these vaccines and antivirals. My simple philosophy in life, including with the current pandemic, better to be safe than sorry. At present, I think most Australians are feeling pretty sorry about where we've landed ourselves.
Thank you. One of the most overwhelming concerns for our generation are the impacts of climate change. How do you believe Australia should respond to climate change, especially in terms of balancing concerns for our domestic economy and environment?
Well, this is perfectly doable. In government, I did 3 things. One, I ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which for the first time put Australia into the same framework for global greenhouse gas reductions as other major economies. Up until then, the Liberal and National Party government had refused to ratify that particular protocol, which had been produced by the United Nations. Why was that necessary? Because unless you are acting in concert with other countries and agreeing to a series of cuts each and together, then ultimately it doesn't affect the planet. Second thing we did was we legislated the mandatory renewable energy target against considerable political opposition. We got it through by 1 vote. When I was elected, renewables represented less than 4% of total electricity supply in Australia. So I put through a law to the Parliament which said we shall be 20% renewable energy by 2020. Everyone thought the sky would fall in, that industries would collapse, that would be the end of the Australian energy market. Guess what? As of this year, we are currently 23% of electricity supply coming from renewables as a result of the legislative act from our government. Third thing we did was we put a legislated price on carbon. And that was the third time we tried it through the Parliament because it was rejected twice earlier by the Conservatives. And as a result of that, the Conservatives, when they defeated us in 2013, then repealed the carbon price. So that's the history of how we've got to where we've got to. I think they're all necessary parts of an overall strategy of dealing with climate change. I believe right now, in terms of meeting our international obligations as Australia, what we need to do is to do three big things. One, immediately agree to, with the rest of the developed world, to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. Australia at present is the only developed economy holding out against that. It's a disgrace. The second is the next set of, shall we say, carbon reduction commitments, what's called the 2030 targets, are up for negotiation at this year's Conference of the Parties to the Climate Change Convention to be held in Glasgow in November. And Australia, once again, is holding out from putting forward a bold reduction in carbon emissions. That must change so that we join the rest of the world in playing our part, given that we represent 1.5% of global emissions ourselves. And others will look at our failure to act as a reason for them not acting. The third thing is take that renewable energy achievement that we've delivered on the basis of our legislation, that 23%, and let's boost it as far as possible. And given the fact that through the mandatory renewable energy target and actions by some other governments around the world, the unit price of renewable energy and its reliability over time has improved enormously. And so as a result, this is much more doable than it was. The trade-off between to act on climate change means to kill the economy and jobs is frankly now a nonsense argument, just like it was a nonsense argument when I first was confronted with it back in the 2013 election by Tony Abbott.
Fantastic, thank you. Our last question for today. As an avid handballer, will you be calling on the International Olympic Committee to make Australian handball an Olympic sport by the 2032 Brisbane Olympics?
Absolutely. In fact, my son Max and I have been seeking to prepare a video clip calling upon all Australian handballers to unite, to petition the Australian Olympic Committee to introduce handball Australian style, four square, not that European stuff, into as a formal Olympic sport. So watch this space. We'll be out there calling upon handballers of the world and handballers of Australia to unite. By the way, when I'm next in Canberra, if you guys are up for it, I'll come out for a game of handball. So,
That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely.
but I intend to do you like a dinner. So,
you can try, Mr. Rod. With all due respect, you can try.
Well, you've never been on the receiving end of my famous Melbourne dog shot. So, and my COVID overhead smash. I've also developed a new shot called the Sydney Slam. So just get ready. So I take no prisoners on the handball court because, as you know, I'm the acclaimed global handball king. So.
I see. Well, Mr. Rudd, thank you again for your time today. We really appreciate your insight into all these pressing issues, and all the best for your future endeavours in handball and your campaigning in regards to it for the Olympics. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jai. Thanks, Astrid. Thanks, Hannah.